Hello there! Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I'm doing great, thank you very much, and lots of love to all of you. I really appreciate every one of my listeners, and personally I'm so thrilled you love these stories because I can't think of anything that is better than a really good story. It beats television any day of the week as far as I'm concerned. And I just have a passion for storytelling, so I'm so glad you enjoy these stories. So before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and tonight we've got a lovely mystery which I think you're really going to enjoy. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, Sharon Denver was fast asleep when the loud, doggedly determined knocking was heard at the front door of her Buckhead apartment in Atlanta. She leaned towards her bedside lamp to switch it on, and in her just-awake clumsiness, her shaking fingers very nearly dislodged the glass tumbler of water perched on the side table that was rattling precariously from the aftershock of almost taking an unfortunate tumble, where it invariably would have crash-landed on the hardwood floor, breaking into smithereens, which in Sharon's opinion was not a good omen, although her sister Nicolette insisted that breaking glass with water inside it was considered terribly lucky. Through bleary, half-asleep eyes, she begrudgingly glanced at her clock on her nightstand, visibly groaning when she saw the time. It was 2:05 in the morning, for goodness sake. You've got to be joking. The knocking persisted. Whoever was at the front door did not appear to be going away in a hurry. Who could be knocking at her door at this ungodly hour of the morning, she wondered, feeling a trifle affronted to have her sleep so rudely interrupted, but also rather apprehensive about who it could be knocking on her door at this late hour, and what that knock would ultimately mean. She had been thrown out of her dark, inauspicious nightmare when she'd been dragged down a long, dark alley by her ex-boyfriend Art, who had been pulling her legs and leering at her with a triumphant, gormless grin on his face. "I've got you now. You're not getting away. You can never escape me, Sharon. I'm always here." Perhaps Sharon should have been pleased to have been roused from such an ominous, unsettling dream, but she was not. Ostensibly, even nightmares could be moderately entertaining. After all, they were just movies in the mind that entertained you while you slept. Besides, she knew very well that in real life, her easygoing, fun-loving ex-boyfriend Art imposed absolutely no threat to her at all. Besides, he was already happily dating someone new, and had probably long since forgotten about her, although that thought irked her considerably, as no one likes to feel that they've been forgotten so easily. Grim, dark shadows danced around her bedroom, announcing the late hour, but moments later they were interspersed with flashing blue lights that trespassed across her walls. In that moment, Sharon knew unequivocally that there must be a police car parked in front of the apartment block. The blue lights were revelatory. What were the police doing at her apartment block at this late hour? Had something really bad happened? The knocking sounded again. Sharon eased herself reluctantly out of bed, mumbling disconcertingly to herself under her breath that she was actually coming. I mean, whoever was at the door banging away should have some courteous consideration for people being inconsiderately roused from their sleep in the middle of the night or early hours of the morning like this. When Sharon reached the front door, she peered rather reluctantly through the spy hole, as she knew you could never be too sure who might be on the other side of the door. She'd seen enough insanitary movies in her life of uncongenial strangers at the door that you'd never ever invite in unless you wanted a rendezvous with the Grim Reaper himself. She always remained cautiously vigilant whenever she answered the door at a late hour. "Who is it?" she called, placing her ear against the wood-panelled door. "It's the police," came the voice. "The name is Detective Robert Cox. May I have a quick word with you, ma'am?" Sharon knew that anyone could pretend to be a policeman on the other side of the door in order to cunningly manipulate their way into the apartment at this late, lonely hour of the night. But it was something about the urgent professional tone of the man's voice, combined with the blue flashing light she'd seen only moments before flashing across her bedroom walls, that Sharon knew that he was speaking the truth. "I can show you some ID, ma'am, if you like," said the voice on the other side of the door. "I don't mind pushing it through your letterbox." "No, it's all right. I believe you," said Sharon. Sharon pulled back the chain of the door, and through the open crack she could see a rather handsome man standing out there, his back as straight as a pencil, his demeanour very professional. Sharon noticed the gentleman was not wearing a police uniform, but plain clothes. He presented to her with his ID. She took it from him through the crack in the door and studied it for a brief second. The word detective grabbed her attention. She unlatched the chain and opened the door, while he stood in the doorway, a tall, imposing, debonair young man, who took up so much space because of his height, so that Sharon could not see what was going on in the corridor outside the door. But she had heard low, earnest voices, and a scuffle of urgent activity in the background. What on earth was going on, she privately wondered. There was no way this apartment block should be so busy at this godless hour of the night. Something was almost certainly happening around her, and whatever it was, Sharon knew instinctively it was not good. "Sorry for waking you, ma'am, at this very late hour. I'm afraid there's been an unfortunate incident in the apartment building. I need to ask you a few questions, if I may." The good-looking detective studied her through what Sharon would describe as rather fetching hazel green eyes that she found attractive. As Sharon stood in the doorway, she suddenly felt very self-conscious. The detective with his broad shoulders was exactly her type. She knew she probably looked like a scarecrow, with her rather tousled hair flying all over the place, but she couldn't help the mischievous, disobedient behaviour of her untamed hair, that seemed to always have a mind of its own, and enjoyed looking particularly dreadful when a handsome stranger chose to call. Why did that always happen to her, she wondered, that you would look your very worst when a potential suitor appeared on the scene? Didn't they say first impressions were absolutely everything? She began to awkwardly straighten her hair with the back of her hand to tame down the mess of her tumbling curls. She noticed the detective for a brief second appeared to be staring at her pyjamas incredulously. Or had that shocked, rather bewildered look been in her imagination? Sharon could not be sure. Detective Cox was probably quite surprised that someone of Sharon's maturity would be wearing pyjamas covered with pictures of Little Red Riding Hood and the 12 Dwarfs, displayed all over the flannel fabric that was probably only suitable for a 5-year-old to wear. The pyjamas had a story of their own, of course, but the detective did not know that. Sharon's sister Nicolette had made them for her out of some fabric she had used to make her toddler's pyjamas, when Sharon had discovered by mistake that she'd left her pyjamas at home while staying the weekend with Nicolette's family. Nicolette, who was ever resourceful and an excellent seamstress to boot, set to work on her sewing machine, making her sister some snug pyjamas out of the same fabric, and apologized profusely that the flannel was a tad babyish, but it was the only fabric she could find at the time suitable for making warm pyjamas. In the end, the juvenile-looking pyjamas were so incredibly comfortable, Sharon wore them all the time in the privacy of her apartment. In this quintessential moment, she felt herself flushing with self-conscious embarrassment. She folded her arms and looked directly into the detective's eyes. "What kind of incident are you talking about, detective?" The detective took out a notebook and pen. "First things first. Can I ask you your name, ma'am?" "Yes, of course you can. My name is Sharon Denver." "Sharon Denver," said the detective, scribbling down her name on his pad and looking up at her through inquiring eyes. "How long have you lived in this apartment block, Mrs. Denver, or is it Miss?" he said, his eyes quickly travelling across to her fingers to see if she was wearing a wedding band. "It's Miss Denver, but you can call me Sharon if you like. I've been living here for the last 4 years. I moved in here when I was 22 years old. Everybody keeps themselves to themselves in this apartment block. When I moved here, I thought I'd make friends. But people here are quite elusive, you know, very private, if you know what I mean. I don't even know my neighbours, although I guess we're all familiar with each other's faces and the cars we drive. I share this apartment with my roommate, but she's not here at the minute. She's gone away for the weekend."
"I see," said Detective Cox. "I did get the impression in my inquiries knocking on people's doors that no one appears to know each other around here very well, which is a pity. Your roommate, what is her name, if I may ask?"
"Her name is Freya Warrington."
"So where exactly did Freya go for the weekend?"
"Do you really need to know something like that, Detective? I don't see why that should concern you."
"Well, I need to be thorough in my investigation, Miss Denver."
"Well, she went to stay at her parents' farm in North Carolina. From what I've gleaned, she comes from a very close family. I don't actually know her very well. She only moved into this apartment a month ago, you see. So we've not really had a chance to get to know each other better." "Yes, she's always busy, running around, you know, that kind of thing."
"So she's busy, is she?"
"Yes, very busy as it happens. You see, she rushes off to work in the mornings and returns to the apartment reasonably late. I believe she's a graphic designer, but I've never seen anyone that rushed off their feet, if you know what I mean. I get the impression she's terribly ambitious, but I guess you'd have to be to work the hours she does. She doesn't eat breakfast in the morning or even grab a coffee. She's out of the apartment before I even get up. She returns late in an evening, so we're like passing ships in the night, you could say."
"I see, ma'am. So you're sure she didn't come back to the apartment at any time during the day or night?"
"Absolutely not. She took her weekend bag with her with some casual clothes for the weekend. She did actually tell me this morning that she was not coming back tonight, but going straight home to North Carolina. So that's where she's gone. She'd have taken a short flight home, I believe."
"This overnight bag you're talking about, what did it look like, if you don't mind my asking you?"
"You want to know that? Well, it was pink with some silver bling on the shoulder strap and on the edges of the bag. Why would you ask?" At this, Detective Cox's gaze sharpened.
"You're sure that that was the overnight bag she was carrying?"
"Yes, reasonably sure. It's a pretty distinctive bag. Why do you ask, Detective?"
"And she does this regularly, does she? Go off for the weekend to stay with her parents?"
Sharon nodded. "Yes, like I said. She's close to her parents, but then again, I don't really know her terribly well. I haven't known her long."
"I need to ask you, ma'am, whether you were home all evening, or did you go out at any point? Did you have any friends over to the apartment, perhaps, for a drink or something?" he asked.
Sharon flushed, because for a 26-year-old woman to be stuck in her sorry apartment on a Friday night, on her own, was almost sad, pathetic really. But Sharon had not felt like going out on the town to meet friends for drinks. She had feigned a headache in order to spend an evening by herself, in her little Red Riding Hood pyjamas, with only the 12 dwarfs for company. Sometimes she liked it that way, just to switch off from the rest of the world and disconnect in order to recharge her batteries. Besides, it had knocked her for 6 when she'd heard that her ex-boyfriend Art, who she'd broken up with 3 weeks prior, who claimed to have been devastated by the breakup, was now so easily dating someone new. It had hurt her to the quick to think that she could be so easily replaced. It was a bit of a blow to the ego. She wondered if perhaps she was a little green at the gills concerning the new woman in Art's life. Maybe she had cared more about him than she admitted, but he was certainly on her mind, for he had played the leading role in her nightmare this evening. "No, I was here all evening. I did order a pizza, though. It was a margarita."
"What time did you order your pizza, ma'am?"
"I don't see how that can be remotely important, Detective. It's just a stupid pizza, isn't it?"
"Everything is important, ma'am. There is no such thing as a stupid pizza. I'm partial to them myself, you know."
It was probably about 7:30 or so." Once again the detective made more notes, which included the name of the pizzeria she'd ordered her takeaway from. Maybe he thought the delivery man might have seen something on his rounds. It seemed as if Detective Robert Cox was very thorough, leaving no stone unturned, even asking her about a roommate that wasn't even around when the incident occurred.
"I want to ask you, ma'am, did you hear anything or see anything unusual over the course of the evening or the early hours of this morning? It's very important. I need you to think about this long and hard. Any strange sounds you might have heard, perhaps, that grabbed your attention?"
Sharon shook her head. "I told you, Detective, I was here all the time. I didn't leave the apartment, and I didn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. I did see my next-door neighbour going into her apartment at the time I received my pizza delivery. Her name's Brenda Larkin, I believe. I've kept a parcel for her before, so I remembered her name. I noticed she had grocery bags in her hand, so I guess she'd been out shopping. We nodded at each other in passing, as you do. But as I was saying, I don't know her at all, beyond exchanging a few pleasantries. Are you going to tell me, Detective, what happened tonight? What is this incident about?" Detective Cox did not answer her, but promptly handed her a business card.
"If you can think of anything you might have overlooked, ma'am, could you please give me a call on this number? Any detail can make a world of difference. Believe me, sometimes the most obscure, insignificant details that you may think are completely irrelevant can give us all the answers we're looking for."
Sharon studied the card. "Detective Robert Cox," she said, reading his name out loud.
"That's right," he said, nodding at her. "As I was saying, ma'am, it's very important. If you can think of anything, give me a call."
"Will do so," said Sharon.
"Once again, ma'am, thank you for helping me with my inquiries. I apologize for waking you at such an inconvenient early hour. But sometimes in these kind of scenarios, for a successful outcome, our investigations must begin at once."
"That's all right," said Sharon, closing the door behind her. Sharon's woolly mind, that was a little disorientated when she first got out of bed, was now sharp and alert, dappled with a curious intrigue. What the hell had happened in their apartment block? What on earth was going on? And why was the detective so incredibly evasive, with a dogged refusal to answer her questions? Could he have not at least given her a little clue about what had happened? He had been so quick to brush her inquiry away, as if it was just a few dog hairs on a coat. Did she not deserve to know what was going on in her apartment block? As after all, she lived here, didn't she? She ambled over to her bathroom to cautiously observe her sorry reflection in the mirror, and to reveal to herself the true horror of what she'd looked like when opening the front door to a handsome stranger. Talk about bad timing, with a debonair man like Robert Cox standing in the doorway. She'd have very much liked to have been wearing one of her head-turning dresses, like the blue one she owned with the high neckline, that always made men give her a second glance. She did look a sight for sore eyes this evening, with her hair frolicking wildly over her head in a tangled mess. It didn't help she was wearing such babyish pyjamas. She could only wonder what Detective Robert Cox must have thought of her. That she was whimsical, naive, childlike perhaps. A woman in her early 20s fixated over Little Red Riding Hood. There was a cloying, nasty taste in the back of her mouth, so Sharon brushed her teeth rigorously, returning back to bed with minty fresh breath, feeling restlessly unsettled about the disarming events of the night, so much so it was hard to get back to sleep. The moment she'd been roused from her slumber, when the detective had knocked on the door, and she'd been dragged away from her nightmare, she had felt decidedly off. Perhaps it was the discombobulating thought of her ex-boyfriend Art in another woman's arms. She wondered why this bothered her so very much. Maybe her ego was crushed because he'd been so quick to replace her, like buying a brand new set of trainers after your others have become obsolete. She knew that she had been the one that had walked away from their relationship, but even so she was beginning to feel a few waves of regret about her decision to break up with him. Her life had become so lonely without him, to fill in the lonely gaps. But after seeing Detective Cox at the door this evening, she had felt something between them that she couldn't explain. Or maybe she was hoping she could feel something between them. Maybe she wanted to feel something. That was probably more like it. She was romanticizing about a brief encounter with a very good-looking man, who probably would never give her a second glance. She reluctantly climbed under her duvet, lying under it with her head pressed against the pillow. Her eyes remained wide open. She wondered what it was that Detective Cox was investigating. She thought about the people that lived in this apartment block in Buckhead. She had told Detective Cox she didn't know the people that lived here, and that was true. But in passing she recognized familiar faces. She did recall there was a dodgy-looking character she'd seen coming out of apartment number 36 from time to time. She had not mentioned this fact to Detective Cox, as it might have appeared like indiscriminate character assassination on her part, for she knew you should never judge a book by its cover. Her mother had taught her that lesson when introducing her to a woman who looked like she lived on the streets all her life, because she was so dishevelled and unkempt. Sharon was to later find out she was one of the wealthiest women in Atlanta, living in an illustrious residence, but it was clear the woman paid so little regard to her appearance. She did recall when the dodgy-looking man in question had climbed into the lift with her at the apartment block to get to a higher floor, that she had instinctively clung to her purse as tightly as she could, as she felt it was under threat of being snatched. She had wondered how a man with a stained string vest that looked like it had been worn for several days, with something messily spilled down the front that looked ominously like coffee, could live in an upmarket apartment block like this. How could he possibly afford the rent when he couldn't even replace his shirt? Or did he just not care that he looked like an absolute slob? His wild, unkempt, curly brown hair had definitely not seen a barber for over a decade. It looked greasy, as if it had actually been washed in salad dressing. And furthermore, his stale breath smelt like a brewery, intermingled with heavy spices left behind from his last meal. So when he entered the lift, it had made Sharon want to gag, especially the smell of all that excess garlic. Sharon had privately thought that he was likely the type that was anchored to his settee all day long, watching daytime television, smoking spiffs, drinking beers, and ordering a plethora of takeaways, while doing dodgy deals on his phone with people who sold drugs for a living, or something else equally as underhanded and duplicitous. There was something not quite right about him, she thought, and she considered herself a reasonably good judge of character. His rogue dark eyes had been scanning her somewhat licentiously, as though he was thinking to himself that she was a bit of all right, while they stood side by side in the lift, waiting to get to their respective floors. The man's wandering eyes had felt as intrusive as an aeroplane luggage scanner, going right through the fine details of your luggage. He had given her a gormless cheesy grin and said,
"The name is Red, by the way, as in the colour red. My surname is Redford, you see. Everybody calls me Red. If you want to pop in for a drink another time, you are welcome. Any time you're welcome. I've seen you around the apartment block before. I like to get to know people living around here."
Once again he gave her another big full grin, showing off a set of yellowing teeth that probably had not seen a toothbrush in weeks. He patted his sizable girth and said,
"I make a mean meatloaf, by the way. It's my grandmother's secret recipe. If you're interested, I'm cooking on Tuesday night. Pop in any time, and you can have a lovely helping. It's delicious. You won't be disappointed. You know I'm telling you the truth, 'cause there ain't such a thing as a good skinny cook," he said, letting out a laugh. "Remember, I'm apartment 36. If you get lonely, you know where you can come. You're welcome any time."
"Thanks," she had said, looking down at the carpet of the lift to avoid his intrusive gaze. When he got off to his level, he said,
"Well, I'll see you when I see you,"
he said, walking away, while Sharon visibly sighed with relief when she was now safely alone in the lift, with all but the lingering smell of beer intermingled with the nauseating spices and garlic. Of course she had never accepted the vague invitation, for there was something sleazily inappropriate about Red that had made her flesh crawl, even though his invitation had seemed genuinely warm. She had seen this Red character hanging around with a couple of seedy friends in the corridor one night when she'd returned home from a bar with friends. The men he was with were clearly inebriated, smoking and drinking in the corridor, making a rowdy noise. And when Red's friends had seen her, they had let out some wolf whistles, but not until now did it occur to her that Red could have invited trouble to their apartment block. Was this the reason, she wondered, why the police were doing an investigation? It wouldn't surprise her at all if Red was up to his ears in trouble. He looked like the type that might have spent a stint in prison. As Sharon's eyes adjusted to the dark shadows that danced rather ominously around her bedroom, they were still impregnated by flickering blue lights of a police car, possibly more than just one, that flashed across her walls. She climbed out of bed and trotted over to the window, pulling back the curtains to study the street below. She realized there was a lot of frenzied activity going on beneath her. There were 3 police vehicles parked in front of the apartment block, along with a white van which she was sure was forensics. What else could it possibly be? There were people on the street wearing white plastic suits, and she could see that Detective Cox was speaking to a man in earnest. Even though she could not see him personally, she could pick up the solemnness of the occasion. Had someone been murdered? Those were the very thoughts that entered her mind. This had to be a murder. What else could it be? No other event, she thought, would create so much fuss at this late hour. Sharon pulled a blanket out of her closet to wrap around her shoulders, to keep her warm as she continued watching the curious activity going on beneath her feet. The people rushing around backwards and forwards, the serious looks on people's faces. It was a kind of sobering scene she had seen in the movies and on the news, but here on the front street of the Buckhead apartment seemed more than a little bizarre. Moments later, her worst fears were confirmed, when a gurney on wheels was pulled out of the building with a sheet covering a long lump, and it was being placed in the back of a coroner's van. It must be a body, she thought. Detective Cox was standing with the man that Sharon guessed must be the coroner, and there was a lot of nodding and shaking of heads going on, as they engaged in serious conversation together. Detective Cox was taking down yet more notes, rather vigorously in his black notepad, like he had done with her earlier on in the evening. Seeing this unfortunate conundrum unfold before her eyes, like a scene in the movies, made Sharon suddenly feel incredibly isolated and alone. She wanted to call her father at once and tell him what was going on outside her apartment block, but she was not sure how her call would be received. She tried to convince herself that her dad would be cool if she woke him up at 4 o'clock in the morning. But on reflection, if she phoned him up at this time, he'd probably think she'd been involved in a near-fatal car accident and be freaking out, while her paranoid, overwrought mother would be clucking like a mother hen, getting her knickers in a twist about absolutely everything and nothing. You only had to say the word murder to her mother, and Sharon knew her days staying at the apartment block here in Buckhead would be numbered. Furthermore, if she told them about what was going on beneath her window, her helicopter parents would whisk her away from her independent life faster than you could say Albert Einstein. She could almost imagine her mother shaking her soft head of peroxide blonde curls and saying, "The world is such a dreadful, dreadful place, Sharon. In my day it was safe to walk down the street, you know, to let your kids play out of doors. We did it all the time when I was growing up, and my parents never blinked an eyelash. It was safer back then, so much safer, but now things have changed exponentially. If there's been a murder in your apartment block, it proves what me and your father have been saying all along. It's not safe for you to live on your own, Sharon, until you're married. Please move in with us, love. You know it makes sense." Sharon could visualize the interchange of their conversations that would reach a stalemate, as Sharon was as obstinate as her mother was at times, but at the end of the day, her mother most often masterfully got the upper hand with her persuasive arguments. If she phoned her parents right now, they would be at her apartment within 10 minutes flat, as the family semi-detached house was only 10 minutes away. And when they got to Sharon's apartment, she was in no doubt that they would begin flapping around like a couple of flustered pigeons, panicking over everything. She knew calling them would be sealing her own fate, and her independence would drop out of her life like a bird dropping on a windscreen window. She could envision them nagging her to come home over and over again, and at 26 she valued her newfound independence. She wondered if there was anybody else she could possibly call right now, but no name came to mind, and even her older sister Nicolette would certainly not appreciate a call at this time of the morning. As with the demands of raising 2 little toddlers, her sister was permanently exhausted and valued sleep as if it was as precious as the crown jewels. Sharon knew phone calls could scare the living daylights out of people at this late hour, but the inauspicious events of the night had disquieted her considerably, and she wanted to share her troubled thoughts with someone, to ease her somewhat befuddled mind. But there appeared to be no one she could talk to. It was so discomposing and creepy to be watching people beneath her feet, moving to and fro, many still wearing plastic suits. Somehow sharing her feelings with a friend would probably have made her feel more grounded, and the events of the evening seem a lot less daunting. Someone had been murdered in this apartment block. Well, that's what she couldn't help but conclude. So would she ever feel safe again? She wondered as an ominous picture of Red's face flashed into her mind. Was he behind these current inauspicious events, she wondered? When people rented apartments here, even if they were reasonably well off, were they properly vetted to check that they had no criminal records and stuff like that? Because Sharon was sure that if they were vetted, then this sort of thing would never happen. Because Sharon knew with a conviction that someone had died this evening in less than favourable circumstances, and the manner of their death had to be suspicious. She had seen it all, the body being taken into the gurney of a coroner's van. Something had gone on this night. I'm going to have a long hot soak in the bath, she told herself, as I'm never going to get any sleep now. I might as well wake up and get my day started. Although being a Saturday morning, there was nothing pressing that would need her immediate attention. She could take a walk downstairs later, and a trip to the delicatessens to buy cold meats and bread for lunch. And while she was out and about on the street, she'd sniff around for any snippets of information as to what might have occurred in her apartment block in the early hours of the morning, as surely someone must know something. She ambled over to the bath and tested the temperature of the water, and fully satisfied that she wasn't going to boil in the water like a lobster, she began to fill up the bath. She sprinkled in some aromatic bath salts, a mix of patchouli, bergamot, and clary sage. She disrobed, lowered herself into the bath, and lay luxuriantly, rather indulgently in the warm water for a long time, soaking in the relaxing scents and enjoying the steam, while closing her eyes as tightly as she could, willing away the haunting images of that recently deceased corpse she had just seen, wheeled on a gurney into a coroner's van. Maybe getting into the bath was a subconscious way of washing away the disquieting event. But if that had been her whimsical, naive belief, she was to be disappointed, for the disconcerted imagery of those men dressed in white kept clawing back rudely into her mind. They were obviously a forensic team, scanning for evidence, trying to look for clues as to who had perpetrated this dreadful atrocity. Sharon could only wonder who the victim of this horrible, wretched crime was, and why anyone would choose to murder this poor person. No one deserved this, surely. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. I told you it was an exciting story. Part 2 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.